start by listening to the passage. Early in the morning, he arrived again in the temple area, and all the people started coming to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in the middle. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such woman. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they could have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. But when they continued asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. And in response, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. So he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore." It's generally agreed by biblical scholars that this passage was not part of the original Gospel of John. The oldest manuscripts of this Gospel do not contain the passage. And in addition, it's used what's considered to be non-Johannine language. For example, John never anywhere refers to the scribes. The passage is much closer in tone and content to the three synoptic Gospels. And the other thing that biblical scholars point to is that if you read the passages immediately before and following this one, this episode seems to be an interruption. So that's the thought. On the other hand, the Council of Trent did consider the passage and made no special declaration about it. Augustine made the argument that maybe the passage was removed from earlier texts of the gospel in order to avoid the impression that Jesus sanctioned adultery. Augustine said this: "Certain people of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest their wives be given impunity in sinning, removed from their manuscript the Lord's act of forgiveness toward the adulteress, as if he who had said sin no more had granted permission to sin." Whether it was part of the original gospel or not, and even some who say it wasn't part of John's gospel don't make the claim that the episode never happened. It's certainly an extraordinarily powerful passage. I had an interesting experience with it. Many of you here were here when Gene Bishop came to speak to the parish, and Gene Bishop and my colleague Mark Osler put on a trial of Christ. They put it on around the country, and the idea is Christ has been convicted of blasphemy, and this is the sentencing stage. And Jean called me one day when they were going to do it in the Twin Cities and asked me if I would play. She wanted to call as a witness the woman caught in adultery. And so it was like entering into an Ignatian contemplation of it. I had to sit on the stand and be this woman. And so I hope they find the video of it, because it was extraordinarily powerful. And what I felt was that sense of being on the ground, hearing the stones start to fall to the ground as people walked away, and looking up and seeing Jesus, right? And that so to felt that sense of the woman, that no one had ever talked to her this way, no one had ever shown that kind of compassion and mercy. It's extraordinarily powerful experience. Let's look at what goes on here. The scribes and the Pharisees are presented to us, as always, looking for a chance to trap Jesus. And here they think they've found the perfect situation to do so. Right? Trying to catch Jesus between the demands of Mosaic law and the law of the occupying Roman forces. Adultery, together with blasphemy and idolatry, was considered a grave sin under the law of Moses. The scribes and the Pharisees are absolutely correct in their assertion that Mosaic law is crystal clear here, that a woman caught in the act of adultery was to be stoned. So if Jesus said the woman should be pardoned, how could he claim to be faithful to the tradition of Moses? On the other hand, Roman law had taken away from the Jews the right to put anyone to death. So if Jesus advocates stoning her to death in compliance with Mosaic law, he would be liable to prosecution by the Romans. Right? Heads they win, tails Jesus loses. From their perspective, they have Jesus exactly where they want him. The truth is, they cared not a jot about the woman or about her adultery. All they cared about was a way to try to trap Jesus. So what does Jesus do when faced with this impossible situation? Interestingly, he doesn't engage in any debate with his questioners about the Mosaic law, which would have been very common at the time. It would have been very common to engage in debates. We have had all sorts of commentaries on the Old Testament where people really, engage in deep argument about what the law said. Pope Benedict said this: Jesus did not enter into a theoretical discussion with his interlocutors on this session of Mosaic law. He's not concerned with winning an academic dispute about an interpretation of Mosaic law, but his goal is to save a soul and reveal that salvation is only found in God's love. Well, how does he do that? Right, John says, Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. Right, what are we to make of that? Was he doodling to have some time to collect his thoughts? Maybe making a shopping list for what he needed later? Was he jotting down some notes so his response would be well organized? Was he writing down the names of everybody that was there? One commentator I read, I thought was actually quite interesting. He suggested that Jesus was pointing out how the scribes and the Pharisees themselves had not complied with the law. First, whenever someone was caught in adultery, the law required that both the man and the woman be brought to the temple gate and accused. Here, however, only the woman was brought, so already we have a violation of the law. Second is that the priest was then required to stoop down and write what law had been broken, along with the name of the accused. It was actually supposed to be written in the dust of the floor of the temple. I guess they didn't have someone cleaning the floors very well. The man too? The names. So they were supposed to kneel down and write the names of the accused in dust on the floor. And so the suggestion is Jesus' action in actually writing on the ground was a way of showing the accusers that they were not keeping the law. But he would keep the law anyway. They, however, ignore Jesus' action and continue with their accusations. They obviously want Jesus to condemn her. So despite his writing, John says, they continued asking him, at which point we get the line that we're all familiar with: let whoever among you is without sin cast the first stone. Interestingly, he doesn't point out their sins. He simply lets them face their sinfulness themselves. He then continues his writing, and John tells us, and in response, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. They have absolutely no reply to Jesus, who sidesteps their question and puts them on the spot. Talking about this passage, Pope Francis said the gospel, with a certain amount of irony, says that they went away one by one, starting with the eldest. Clearly, they owed a lot of money to the heavenly bank. Father Robert Barron says this about Jesus' instruction that the one without sin be the first to cast the stone. He says, Jesus forces them to turn their accusing glance inward where it belongs. Instead of projecting their violence outward on a scapegoat, they should honestly name and confront the dysfunction within them. This story, like all the stories in the Gospels, is a foreshadowing of the great story toward which we are tending. Jesus will be put to death by a mob bent on scapegoating violence. And so in the end, All that's left is Jesus and the woman. And what about Jesus' response? Right? He doesn't condemn her. Neither do I condemn you. Why does he respond with such compassion and forgiveness? And I think the answer is because Jesus knew that even those trapped in the worst sins, and remember, this was, under Jewish law, one of the worst sins, a sin punishable by death, but that even those trapped in the worst sins could be redeemed. And that's what the Jewish leaders didn't count on. They did not count on Jesus' love and compassion. They did not understand his claim that God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through them. Jesus knew that not just this woman, but that everyone is tainted by sin, that everyone needs salvation. Thomas Brody says in his commentary on this passage, in dealing with the woman who is already quite aware of her sinfulness, Jesus opens up for her a new place of forgiveness and peace. Jesus' treatment of the woman illustrates that in Jesus' hands, the law of Moses is the source of life rather than an instrument of death. Right? Contrary to the fear that Augustine suggested that early packagers of the gospel had, Jesus is clearly not condoning sin. Right? Go and sin no more, he tells the woman. He knows we'll be tempted to sin, but expresses his confidence that we are capable, through him, of overcoming it. In the first homily he gave after he was elected Pope, Pope Francis chose to speak on this text of the woman being caught in adultery. And he made a couple of points. First, he said, sometimes we too like to reproach others, to condemn others, right? And we're back to the elder son in the prodigal son, that we all have a little bit of the Pharisees and the scribes in us. And again, it's important when we read these passages that we not go, oh yeah, those are the good guys over there, right? I'm clearly in the good guy camp, but to pay attention to where we find some of those tendencies with us. And second, he made the point that all that's necessary for us to experience God's mercy is to recognize that we're in need of it. And he spoke again, I mean, clearly, as I said at the outset, Francis views mercy as the central theme of Jesus, and so it's not surprising he's spoken on this passage on more than one occasion. He spoke about it again last April, saying, God forgives us not with a decree, but with a caress and with mercy. He says, Jesus goes beyond the law and forgives by caressing the wounds of our sins. He describes the woman in this passage as being full of shame, and Jesus saying to her, and now this is Francis again, you know, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? We are alone, you and I. You are before God, with no accusations, no gossip, you and God. And Francis makes the point, talking about this, that the woman did not claim to be a victim of false accusations. She didn't defend herself, denying her crimes. She acknowledged the sin. And so Francis concludes from the exchange between Jesus and the woman, Jesus forgives, but there is something more than forgiveness. Because as confessor, Jesus goes beyond the law. Right? In fact, the law stated, there was no confusion about the law stated clearly she had to be punished. And Jesus, of course, could have cast the first stone because Jesus was without sin. But, says Francis, Jesus goes further than that. He does not say adultery is not a sin, but he does not condemn her with the law. He does not humiliate her. He says, go and sin no more. This is the mercy of God. And Francis adds that this obviously applies to us as well, right? How many of us deserve to be condemned for one sin or another? Not suggesting we're a room full of adulterers. But that we deserve condemnation, that condemnation for our sins would be quite just, yet God forgives with mercy. And I love the analogy that Francis uses. He says it's like the sky. We look at the sky when it's full of stars, but when the sun comes out in the morning with all its light, we don't see the stars anymore. That's what God's mercy is like, a great light of love and tenderness, because God forgives not with a decree, but with a caress. He does so by caressing the wounds of our sin, because he is involved in forgiving. He is involved in our salvation. And we're meant to understand, and I think the reason that this sin is used in this context, this sin that was considered one of the gravest sins under Mosaic law, we're meant to understand that there is nothing that can cut us off from God's love and mercy, right? No sin that casts us adrift without the ability to receive God's mercy. Francis observed, there are those who feel that need but think they are irredeemable because they have done too many bad things. And Francis, again, discussed this with Andrea, I never pronounce his name right, Tornielli, whose published interview, he has an extended published interview with the Pope that was published under, the name of the book is called The Name of God is Mercy, and I highly recommend it. It's a really beautiful series of discussion between the author and Francis. And in this dialogue with Tornielli, Pope Francis referenced a dialogue a man had with him once. He referenced a man coming to him before he was Pope and saying, "Oh, Father, if you knew my life, you wouldn't talk to me. You wouldn't talk to me like that. I've done such terrible things." Right? And Francis' reply was, "Even better, go to Jesus. He likes to hear about these things. He forgets. He has a special knack for forgetting. He forgets. He kisses you. He embraces you. And he says, 'Neither do I condemn you. Go and from now on, do not sin anymore.' That's the only advice he gives. If things haven't changed in a month, we go back to the Lord. The Lord never tires of forgiving. Never. It is we who tire of asking him for forgiveness. We need to ask the grace not to get tired of asking for forgiveness, because he never gets tired of forgiving." Right? We never ask for the grace to never tire of asking, because he never tires of forgiving. Again, it's not license to sin, but it's an acknowledgement of our human tendencies, right? Because mercy does not mean that there has not been some kind of sinful act. And you may remember there was a lot of confusion created by the soundbite quote of the Pope on his return flight from the trip to Rio de Janeiro, "Who am I to judge?" And people thought that as, this is license for anything. And particularly, there was an issue about, well, how does this square with the Church's position on homosexual behavior? And this is not inviting a discussion on the Church's position here, but just an understanding of what the Pope said in the context of the Church's position. And when he was asked about that remark by Tornielli for this book, The Name of God is Mercy, the Pope said this: "On that occasion I said this: if a person is gay and seeks out the Lord and is willing, who am I to judge that person?" I was paraphrasing by heart the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where it says that these people should be treated with delicacy and not marginalized. I'm glad we're talking about this, because before all else comes the individual person in his wholeness and his dignity, right? And so Francis is constantly saying, everybody gets to come back. Everybody gets to come back. And I think there are a lot of issues that this episode with this woman invites us to think about. I mentioned the trial of Christ. That was presented in the context of the death penalty. What does Jesus' statement to the woman have to say about that issue? So I think a lot of lessons to be drawn from this passage. And let me stop now and just open it to thoughts and comments about it. Yeah, Matt.
I'm not sure how many you had a chance to read Tom's message in the bulletin this week.
Not yet.
Well, it's about our prison population and overcrowding. I think there's a direct analogy to how our society now is creating right and wrong with, you know, these mandatory sentences and these drug laws that have completely escalated the prison population. But there's an analogy there where I think we're using a lot of our laws in our society to create right and wrong people.
Right.
And showing no mercy. And by the way, my family views me as some whack job conservative, so I say that in the sense of wanting less, but understanding some
Right.
of our laws
Right.
maybe too punishing. And there's no mercy.
Right. Right, and there's an enormous difference between right and wrong acts, or good and bad acts, and right and wrong people. Right? And that's what I think, if we're approaching everybody with mercy, right, I'm not judging everybody by the worst act that they committed, right, or not defining them is a better way to put it. Yeah, and then right.
We as Christians always forgive our fellow human being.
Well, we're supposed to. Yeah, we are. Yes, we are meant to forgive.
I've done this several times in my lifetime. Because people have accused me of doing things. I've been impeached from a chairperson because they thought I was stealing money out of their treasury, and I wasn't. This is.
Yeah, and right, and you're speaking differently, right? We're talking in one sense there's God's mercy, but also, yes, you're quite right. We are commanded to forgive each other, and that's maybe one of the hardest things that we're asked to do. Ray, you were going to say?
Just a technical question. Did the Romans really want to execute people who violated Mosaic law? I would think not. I think
The Romans, no, but they took that power out of the hands of.
Yeah, I understand that. But
Yeah.
so in other words, for most blasphemy or anything else, they probably just say, go back. But certainly if they killed somebody, a high priest or somebody, they probably would.
Yeah, that's my sense, and I'm not at all, a deep historian of this period. But my sense is that what the Romans would do is, if it was the kind of crime that was a disturbance to the social order, that they would. But in some cases, it was, you might think of it as almost the equivalent of saying no death penalty for those things. Yeah.
How do you suppose this got into the Mosaic law? I mean, it's not part of the Decalogue. Where did they just develop it, or what?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Patrice, do you, that where the origin of the Mosaic law of stoning for adultery?
I don't know, but I know that some of you go into Chronicles and some of those other, the book of the Pentateuch that I hate to read.
Yeah.
Because it's so friggin' boring. But there's a lot, I mean, it really is.
Yeah, and it might be I don't know, it might be in Leviticus. I don't know the answer to that, but it probably is.
There's a lot of Mosaic law that's included that are more specific than specific laws than what the Decalogue would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like 600 commandments.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where I'm thinking of probably is, because there's a lot of laws regarding sexual behavior.
Right.
In that.
Was it developed by the rabbis over time?
No, it's in the book. It's my bet is it's in the book of Leviticus, but it's not. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's very technical.
Right. How often people were stoned for adultery, that I don't know. As I say, in this case, it's clear. The scribes and the Pharisees are not interested at all in this particular woman. She just becomes the occasion for trying to test Jesus, right? Because that happens over and over again. They're constantly looking for some way to trap him in something. Well, yeah, right. And and Jesus just never gets into it, right? Because the normal human intuition, I think, would be to get into an argument with them over that, and Jesus just stands back and says, not playing, not playing with us.
Some people thought it's Mary Magdalene. Is there any truth to that? Or
Say that again?
some people thought that the woman was Mary Magdalene.
No, the church long ago, I think back in, 1960, did away with this idea that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. And I think what happened is there are several Marys that got conflated. But no, so for years, poor Mary Magdalene got this rap. But you know, it's interesting. I think it was 1960, which, you know, 1960 now is a long time ago. I still occasionally hear a priest somewhere talking about Mary Magdalene, the adulteress, and, you know, poor woman was this, you know, wonderful follower of Christ, right? You know, and she still gets that that rap, right? These old stories don't die easily.
Listening to interpretation of this on the Catholic channel just this week on the radio, they said that the Pharisees brought her to Jesus, but they picked her up, and they had two people that accused her, and then they went back afterwards, and someone took one of the Pharisees aside and asked, "Wonder which tree was it she caught?" And he said, "Maybe a sycamore tree." And then the other one came back and says, "Okay, where did you see her do it?" Under like the oak tree. I don't know what name.
Not this story. That's the first story you're talking. That was the first reading. The story of poor Susanna.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was the one where, you know, Susanna, who is this chaste, innocent person, is accused. These men want to have sex with her. Yeah, that's that story, which is often paired with the woman with the story of the woman caught in adultery. And it's interesting pairing, because in that one she's actually innocent, and in this one there's no question about the guilt of the woman. Yeah. Other thoughts about this?
One of the phrases is beginning with the elder, or beginning with the eldest.
Yeah.
Does that have any current application?
Yeah. What would you? How would you comment on that?
Is he the most wise or the most sinful?
Yeah, exactly, right. And clearly from the comment that Francis made about it, there's a sense, yeah, the most sinful of it. But yeah, I mean, imagine if you're standing in the crowd, right, and that question gets put, or that, right, let he's without the first sin cast the first one. And imagine that picture of one by one dropping the stones and walking away. Yeah. Let's just take a couple minutes in quiet reflection. I'm just going to read it one more time. And if you have it, don't read along with it, right? Just kind of close your eyes, listen to it, and let's just take a couple minutes of silent reflection on it. Early in the morning, he arrived again in the temple area, and all the people started coming to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in the middle. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they could have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. But when they continued asking him, he straightened up. When he continued asking him, he straightened up and said, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone at her." Again he bent down and wrote on the ground. And in response, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. So he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Women, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, do not sin." You know, one of these issues with these passages that we know so well is that, you know, we tend to start to read them and go, "Oh yeah, right, I know that one." And so, you know, my encouragement is to try to sit with it, again, as though you were hearing it for the first time. And as we said at the outset, to not think of it in terms of, I'm out here all the bad guys in the story are over there. And if I identify with anyone, it's the good guy. But to think about how it reflects on our own behavior. So, now as we move into Holy Week, it's good to look back over these 4 sessions that we've had on these and ask ourselves, and this is the question I ask for you, and 2 questions, and you can answer either or both. What have I learned about God's mercy? And what are the challenges that exist for me? So what have you learned about it? We've taken 4 different parables here, very powerful one, or 4 different stories. What do you learn about God's mercy?
He's a forgiving God.
Okay.
The vineyard story that we had last week tells me that in my lifetime I can go forward without fearing anything that will hurt me because I have been forgiven many times.
Yeah, that parable is such a wonderful one, right? Because again, there are a lot of different ways to read that third servant in that parable. And one of the ways is precisely as a fearful person, right? Afraid to take any risks. Yeah, Nanny.
I have loved this Lent. I think someone, Father, you might have said this, that Lent is a joyful time. Did you ever say that? I might have heard you say that.
I did. Whether I completely believe it or not is another thing. But I do. I think I did say that at the beginning.
I have found that, and in so many thanks to you all, really, here, to helping me with my journey. I love what you just said about God forgives us with a caress. And
yeah, it's beautiful.
What I have come to believe during this Lent is that that's true. I don't even know how to explain it, but the teaching that I've gotten this Lent here has made me rethink so many things. I am a great Pharisee, first of all, in my judgment of others. And I realize I have absolutely no right to do that. In some cases, yes, but I have no right to do that.
Notice that addition there.
Well, there is evil. So there is evil that exists in our world.
Right.
So I put that in a weird category. So I'm uncomfortable with evil. So this has been remarkable, this whole 4-week period, and the caress thing is just like a light bulb. Because we think of, at least I do, I compare God's forgiveness of me with my forgiveness of my children, and trust me, there has been a lot to forgive. And I'm sure that they have felt the same way about me. But I do it with love. I always forgive my kids with just so much love, and I'm grateful that they can come to me with things that are on their mind, much of which I don't want to hear, but I do, and that we can discuss those things. So that's what God wants. He wants a discussion from me with him, and he wants to direct me in the best way possible for me. So that brings us to acceptance of his will no matter what. Did that make any sense?
It did, and Nan, real quick in response, that one of the things that Susan and I talked about is that, so there's 2 sides to this. One is, if one person has an experience like you just articulated, then all of this preparation and lining this up is all worth it. It's not surprising because this is God's word. And God's word, like mercy, is transformative. But it also encourages us to continue to exhort the parish that people would avail themselves of these opportunities because of precisely what you just said. It is truly, a transformative experience to sit with God's word and allow it to work on us in a positive way. And we want that experience for as many folks as we can as we try to build missionary disciples.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Tom.
I was going to say that in response to your question that I thought the breadth of the forgiveness in the stories would let or me at least, to believe that it's all-encompassing, the forgiveness, the mercy. And then man introduces the evil card out. And that does make it difficult, because then are you back in picking and choosing what's evil, and do we then have different ideas about that? So what do you say about that? How does that fit in? Because otherwise it does seem all-encompassing.
Right, but yes, I mean, obviously there is evil and people commit evil acts, but the forgiveness command is a universal one. And
go back to the people and make the forgiveness all-encompassing.
Yeah, I mean, the forgiveness certainly is all-encompassing. The mercy is all encompassing, and God, right? God does not abandon anyone. Right, does not abandon, constantly trying to bring people back. There's this wonderful poem, I wish I had it with me because I won't do justice to it. It's the name of this book, amusingly, is God Went to Beauty School. And it's these series of poems, and the one I love is the one about Lucifer, because it goes through, and it's, and God called him Lucy for short. And, they had this fight and they left, but it kind of ends with this sense of, the truth is the two of them never stop asking about each other. Like, God's always saying how Lucy's doing, Lucy's saying how God's doing, and it ends with, and God's always hoping Lucy will come home again, right? So that sense of even the devil, that sense that God never stops trying to bring all things back to God's self. And so it doesn't negate that there's sin, it doesn't negate that there's evil, but that sense that God never divides, and you made the comment before of bad good acts versus bad good people, right? That God never says, no, this group of people is out and excluded, and we can lament the acts and judge the acts, but not limit the forgiveness and the mercy.
Mercy doesn't mean that we're permissive in the face of evil.
Right, right.
And as Tom is noting, yeah, sometimes it's hard to figure out what is God's will and what is contrary to God's will, what is the apparent truth and truth,
right.
That isn't always easy.
Yeah. And so, our hope, I think, in this, right, is that that reflecting on these passages opens us certainly more to God's mercy, but then allows us to be a greater vehicle of that mercy, right? Yeah, Matt.
Last week we went through the practice of stepping into the characters.
Ignatian contemplation, yeah.
Yes, and I thought it was a really good lesson. It's the first time I was introduced to that concept. I've heard about it a lot. I think we bantied around a little bit. I know you're pretty good at it. It may be just the basic process of stepping into the character.
Yeah. Of
contemplating yourself and imagining yourself in that character.
Yeah.
And it was very helpful to me, and it's a whole new way of reading scripture and slowing down. So if we could have that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm surprised that you've never heard it before, because I know that we've done it occasionally here. But no, it's a very, very powerful way of praying with Scripture. I mean, it's certainly a significant part of my own practice, since my spirituality is heavily Ignatian. And if you do the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, it really is the primary form of prayer for a significant chunk of the exercises, right? And so and if you haven't done it before, I really do recommend it. And we can talk about doing more about it in the fall. But yes, the sense of, Ignatius would say, set the scene, right? Read the scene carefully, set the scene, and put yourself in the scene, right? As one of the actors. And allow it to unfold. And if you've been doing this, Matt, Matt has experienced the sense that what happens when you do that is by the power of the Spirit. I mean, you use your imagination to set up the scene, but then how it unfolds is God's thing. But the important thing for Ignatius is that when you engage in this kind of prayer, it's not like I'm sitting on the balcony watching a play, but you're right there, so that if you were in this scene, you might be one of the people holding those rocks, holding one of those rocks, or, if you were praying with the multiplication of the loaves, you're right there with the disciples giving out the bread, or if you're right in the boat with Jesus when Jesus invites Peter to walk on the water, maybe Jesus invites you to walk on the water, right? And to simply allow it to unfold. Yes, it can be an extraordinarily powerful form of prayer. And Ignatius invites it because Ignatius is interested in developing this deep relationship with Jesus. And so what he wants is to me to be with Jesus. And that's why it's so significant part of the prayer when we're praying with Jesus' public ministry. And so, yeah, if you haven't done it, I really, really encourage it. Yeah, Matt.
The second comment related to that is the only way you're going to be able to be merciful is if you have Jesus on there.
Absolutely.
It's like, I'm not being merciful, Jesus is being merciful through.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not, you know, I say this in other contexts so often. This isn't a question of the will. It's not like I'm going to wake up in the morning and say, that's it, man, today I'm just going to be 100% merciful and loving to every person that I see. You know, that might last the first 22 minutes, maybe, assuming I don't see anybody in the first 22 minutes, right? But the idea is that the more I open myself to God's love, to God's mercy, the more then that as a natural result of that, it comes out. I mean, I love that, you know, in the St. Francis prayer, right, this image of make me a channel, that sense that, you know, I'm a conduit, I'm a channel for God's mercy. It's not my mercy, it's that inexhaustible mercy that I want to be able to, you know, bring forth into the world. Yeah, right.
Yeah, this reminds me, it kind of brings up the fact that if you're trying to convert somebody or get them to come back to church, it's not me that does it, it's God that does it,
yeah.
You know. So God is merciful in giving them the opportunity.
All you're doing is being a vehicle, not all in the sense of minimal. Being a willing vehicle is important, but that's an important thing to remember, and it also helps us with humility, right? Again, what did Jesus himself? It's my Father's work I'm about, not my work. It's God's work. Yeah.
I like how you kind of told us to do the theater of the mind. That was good.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful form of prayer. I mean, I've had some of my most powerful, deepest religious experiences using that prayer form. Yeah.
Maybe my take is not appropriate, but when we then move on to look at what happened to Jesus and the trumped up charges against him, I was wondering if they were dropping the stones because perhaps the adultery charge was trumped against this woman. I can't imagine otherwise just letting the stones go down readily. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, she doesn't deny her guilt, so I don't, you know. Yeah.
That was a law. But there's a certain pattern there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would say, why did they drop the stones that readily and walk away? Maybe, you know, what I've always heard was, well, he was writing their sins in the dust. Maybe not. I think it seems like a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't this one of the last events where they're,
right.
You know, challenging him, and then we go on,
mm-hmm.
and he's hauled in and
right.
charged inappropriately.
Yeah, and the truth, of course, with all of these is we have what the gospel writers gave us. So we don't know. Well, yeah, and so was she guilty? Was she not? Was it a trumped up charge? Was it not? And that's why, to me, you know, for our purposes in this, the value is, as I pray with this passage, what is it that God's trying to convey to me? And that's an important thing with the Ignatian contemplation too. Ignatius, like, you know, you don't have to worry about how long the boat would have been, or how many people were in the crowd, or, you know, if I'm praying with Jesus' birth, it doesn't matter if you have him in a stable and you have him in a cave and you have him in the basement of Joseph's family house, right? That's not the point, right? We don't really care about, the question is, as I pray with this, what is God doing to and with me? Because you're right, with some of these stories, we have the text. I don't have any ability to say one way or another about this, yeah.
I work in retreats where people come with a lot of fear and shame.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is the first exercise that we do, and it is incredible the change in people as we work through. And a lot of these people have been through talk therapy,
right.
But the difference between that and actual, you called it an Ignatian experience, mm-hmm. where they act out
mm-hmm.
being that woman, and the deacon or the priest who is with us goes around and asks them, has anyone condemned you? And who's ever there says no, if they want to participate. They haven't, and is told, then neither do I condemn you.
Wow.
And it is, you know,
very
there's
healing.
eye contact, there's, you know, body contact, And what I've read just recently about that is because a lot of these people have already been through, did I already say this, talk therapy? But the difference, the trauma that they've experienced is so deep that that wasn't enough.
Sure.
They needed to actually go through the theater of the mind or the theater of the body. And someone also referred to it as being very sacramental, which our faith is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Real quick comment on with Pope Francis, because you see, and Jane's point, there is it was Christ pushing against the law, expanding the law, fulfilling the law, that created that conflict.
Sure.
And you see it with our present Pope in a very similar dynamic. It's this wideness of mercy that is creating this conflict. And interestingly, Pope Benedict had one of his first interviews since he stepped down as Pope, and was very embracing of Pope Francis's message of mercy, and put it in some really beautiful and typical Benedict terms where it just gets right at the heart of the matter. And so you can see people not line up, they aren't conscious necessarily of what they're doing, some are. But it's this similar dynamic to Christ, where it creates the conflict, as Jane said, that ultimately does usher in the death of Christ.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, let's face it, you know, I made this comment before, that we all have a little bit of the Pharisees and scribes with us, and all of us want God's mercy to be big enough for sure, right, to cover me. But I don't necessarily want God, you know, I mean, I think we don't say it that way, but I think there is that part of us that says, well, yeah, I'm not so sure about that person, right? And God says, no, all means all. Right? And the same thing, right? It's, I mean, and that's the constant challenge with us, right? Love God, love one another, not just love the people who are good to me, who I think are attractive and appealing. Love all means love all. Even the people who don't seem deserving in our way of evaluating things. And, you know, I don't know if you find that challenging. I find it enormously challenging, you know? Yeah, and then back there.
Me personally is, I sometimes judge in my mind, but I don't verbally say it, and I really try to fight it, but you know, it's there. And if you could maybe talk about that a little bit. I mean, I've learned to not get it out, but you also have to deal that you thought about it in the first place.
Yeah, and you know, look, you can't stop a thought from rising, right? But what you can do is recognize it, right, for what it is. And right, the first step, as you say, is not acting on it, right? My choice is what I do, and then the second is to pray from that, right? But yeah, I mean, for some of us, and look, I'm a high J on the Myers-Briggs, so judgment rises real easily for me. But you know, the thing is that the more mindful you are and the earlier you catch it rising, the easier it is to let it go. Right? My example is the difference between blowing out a match and putting out a fire. Right? If I see it, right? If I start to see it arise and go, no, I'm not going there. That's not from God. That's not from God. That's from the enemy spirit. Right? To see it rise and let it go. Because once I let it, because you know, once you start following the story, once you start following that story in your mind, right? Then it's like, you know, yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the message is really well balanced, because, you know, first you kind of learn that God loves you very much and will forgive you and you have mercy.
Right.
And then you become able, you know, being a channel, so then you can provide mercy to others.
Right.
And then you get to a point where you're, you know, a great person, and then you're maybe judging others too much. You may need to go back and think of yourself in the shoes of the person who you forgive.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, none of us, it's not like I have this one great experience of God's mercy and love and now I'm perfect, right? It is this continual process, right, of conforming myself more and more, right, to Jesus, of opening myself, constantly opening and doing. And as you say, yeah, sometimes I go, okay, you know, yeah.
I think the antidote for me of that judgmental process that you were talking about is when that person comes, if it's a person, that person comes into your mind and you're having your judgmental thoughts, to just pray for that person. It is so hard to do, but it really kind of takes the fuse away.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why God's putting that thought in my head.
Yeah, right.
I would say, judge not, or you shall be judged.
Right?
There's a lot of people carry it to extremes, though, and say that God would never let anybody go to hell. You know, so there are school of thought, which is quite large.
Right. Yeah, and
so there's justice and mercy and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, and we know this justice is tempered by mercy, and you know, we could have a whole nother discussion about hell. I think the truth is, I view the kind of question as what happens to anybody at the end of the day as above my pay grade. You know, certainly my hope, my own personal deep hope, is that hell is an empty set, a null set, because to me the banquet won't be complete unless everybody's around the table. But but it seems to me the consequence of free will is that I have to acknowledge at least a theoretical possibility that someone can make an irrevocable no to God. I also believe God keeps trying, but you know.
Yeah, the church is silent on whether any.
Church does not say anybody. The church does not say anybody is in hell.
Von Balthasar, one of the 20th century theologians, who he and Ronner's theology kind of balanced each other. He has Dare We Hope, a book where he makes a case that there is nobody in hell. And then the reality is we just don't know.
Right. Yeah. And I'm fine not knowing. You know, it's just.
They don't make a statement whether anybody's in heaven other than the saints either.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, you know, whether you're mother or father or whatever.
Yeah.
No one's ever came back.
No one's ever come back and told us it. Yeah.
Save us from anxiety after we say the Our Father, and then it's added in there with the priest on the pulpit says it. I like that because sometimes people do have anxious.
Right. And how many times? I once knew the number. How many times Jesus says, "Do not be afraid," right? Over and one of the consistent messages: "Do not be afraid." You know. Anyway, yeah, Tom.
One of the interesting and powerful parts of this is that no one in the crowd walked.
Yeah.
This was a setup.
Right.
You know, one of them, if one of them had said, "I have not sinned," I think they probably all would have said,
"Yeah,
me neither." And there's no other.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure where to go with it.
Yeah.
But then it's to the extent that the crowd is us. I mean, they're not us, but
right.
We're standing. But you know, there are circumstances where you have to face the truth.
Right.
And
yes. Yes.
Even in that situation where you were trying to do them in.
Right.
They were able, for some reason, did that.
Yeah. Well, my recommendation, you know, it's now Sunday. It's astonishing to me to believe we're now entering Holy Week. But, you know, my recommendation in these couple of days, these last few days before the Triduum begins, is to try to find a little time to pray with each of these four primary passages again, and just say, you know, any final thing you want me to get out of this, God, before we do it. And then I guess my just final note would be, and I'm sure Father Dan has said this from the pulpit, but you know, I have to say, I think the Triduum is the most incredibly wonderful, I should say liturgy, because we do treat it as a single liturgy. And this, you know, everything else is important, but this is the crowning point, right, of our faith leading up to Easter. And there's such tremendous beauty going through from Holy Thursday through the Easter Liturgy. So I recognize some people have jobs that don't let them do it, but to the extent you can do it, just please join us for the Triduum celebration here. Final note for you on that?
Susan might have mentioned that she and I are going to do together on the 10th.
Yeah.
And also film night, A Man for All Seasons. If you've seen it, come and see it again. We're going to have great popcorn. But it's just a fantastic, it's Bolt's play, some of the greatest lines in English I think I've ever heard. And it really
It is on April 12th, which is a Tuesday night. And yeah, it's hard to believe that film is now 50 years old. But it really, it's to me in that category of oldie but goodie. It's one that I never get tired of. And so yeah, join us if you can. We'll have more advertisement. I mean, what other advertisements do we have? Mystagogy. Spring Book Club, the end of April. We're going to do short stories of Flannery O'Connor. And so yeah, that'll be really fun. So join us. Yes, Flannery O'Connor for the Easter season.
And why don't we, Susan is extraordinarily generous with her gifts